Welcome to this introduction to the European model clauses. I'm Martijn Scheltema, legal practitioner at Pels Rijk and Droogleven Fortuyn in The Hague, Dutch law firm, and professor at Erasmus University. And today I'm joined by two members of the European Working Group, Sarah Ladouche, who is a professor at Rutgers Law School and the director of the Responsible Contracting Project, and Beata Faracik, who is the co-founder of the Polish Institute for Human Rights and Business. And together we have a nice bunch of perspectives on the model clauses, the practitioner perspective, the academic perspective, and also the CSO perspective at the table. We try to introduce the model clauses in a short period of 15 minutes, which probably will not be enough to have a profound and in-depth insight in the model clauses, but we think that at least to kind of understand what the project is about and what kind of issues we are addressing, I think these 15 minutes will be sufficient. And I will start with the question why there is a working group working on European model clauses. And the most important reason, I think, for this is that the current contractual approaches, which are, of course, necessary to implement human rights due diligence in supply chains in a legally binding fashion, because in those countries where we do not have obligatory human rights due diligence requirements, well, then the contractual approaches are needed to implement this in a legally binding fashion. But the problem is that the current contractual approaches, and Sarah will zoom in on that in her presentation, are not very helpful and effective, and often not appropriate also for especially smaller size suppliers. Because on the one hand, they do indeed require, for example, human rights compliant measures in terms of preventing forced labor, in terms of living wages. But on the other hand, they also aim at lowest prices, last moment alterations, and also have a very much default-oriented approach in terms of human rights impact, where every impact in the chain is kind of seen as an event of default at the supplier level, which may trigger termination. That kind of approaches are not very helpful, to say the least, because they often, worsen the situation instead of improving it. And therefore, we feel that these model clauses are important to provide better strategies and also more human rights compliance strategies in supply chains. And therefore, this project has been established, which aims to come up with model clauses which are aligned with the UNGP's, OECD guidelines, and also, of course, with the CSDDD, on which the Council and the Parliament has recently reached agreement. And the model clauses are built on the model clauses developed by the American Bar Associations, especially 2.0 version of those clauses, but the European model clauses go beyond them in several ways. For example, in connection with the kind of default-oriented approach, which still is a little bit embedded in the ABA clauses. Well, that's where the European model clauses really depart from. Well, we will elaborate later on, especially Beata and Sarah, on the content of the clauses, but it's maybe good to say already that I said they build on the ABA model, but depart from that in several ways. And also important, of course, in Europe, the alignment with the CSDDD will be implemented. And the clauses are, of course, the model clauses themselves, but also have a supporting document with them, which more generally explain why the clauses, specific parts of the clauses are needed. It also provides some practical guidance. For example, if buyers think, well, how to implement, for example, living wage, well, there are some examples of how that could be done. And the third part of the guidance is the country-specific guidance, because, of course, the contract laws in the different member states may diverge. So it also explains, for example, if you want to implement these clauses in Germany, well, what do you have to kind of take into account when implementing them in contracts? Of course, the German Supply Chain Act, but also other aspects of German contract law, well, maybe or may complicate things. So, well, that's then explained in the various member states, though not all the 27 member states yet, but we have chosen to well, do this for the major jurisdictions in Europe, which are momentarily the Portuguese, Spanish, French, German, Polish, and Italian legal systems. And we think that, well, if those clauses are compliant with these legal systems, then probably that will be true for most of the other systems as well. But of course, in a later stage, it could also be achievable to then also try to align them with other legal systems. Finally, the composition of the working group, well, that's kind of connected to the legal systems I have just mentioned. So we have working groups in these, working in these various legal systems. So Polish, a German, a French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian working group. On top of that, we also have a working group zooming in on the European legislation, which may also be relevant. The CSDDD was already mentioned, but of course we have other regulations like the deforestation, batteries, and also the proposed forced labor. So there is a lot of European legislation which will be important here. Okay, I think that will be sufficient for the more general introduction of our model classes. And I now turn to, I think, Sarah, for her presentation on, well, the more in-depth issues connected to contractual strategies in this area. Sarah, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Martijn. It's a real pleasure to be here and to support with this EMC European Model Clauses project. I want to just talk a little bit about, as you said, the ways that companies often get their contracts wrong when it comes to managing human rights and environmental risks. As you said, right, contracts are a critical tool for implementing human rights and environmental due diligence across the supply chain. They are effectively the legal links of the supply chain that connect all the different actors together and give them sort of guidelines and parameters for how to behave with one another. So they're really instrumental for implementing human rights and environmental policies across the supply chain. And we know this is borne out in fact because we know that contracts are the most often used tool for managing human rights and environmental risk across supply chain. However, they tend to be misused for this purpose. And the reason that they are misused is because they tend to be designed to focus on managing company risk rather than human rights risk. And the way that they manage company risk when it comes to human rights and environmental impacts is that they tend to be used to shift risk. So companies will use their contracts to shift their responsibilities, shift the risk, shift the obligations related to human rights and environmental due diligence onto their business partners, oftentimes, right, their suppliers, including in SMEs within Europe and in production countries. And one thing that is really an important insight that animates the European model clauses, the EMCs, is this idea, this understanding that risk shifting is not the same thing as risk management. If we want to effectively manage human rights risks, we have to adopt a different approach. So the ways that contracting as usual doesn't work are threefold, and we need to move away from those, as I will discuss in a moment. So the three defects, core defects, I would say, of contracting as usual is that they tend to rely on one-sided, supplier-only promises of perfect compliance. These are representations and warranties or guarantees of perfect compliance with a supplier code of conduct that says, there is no forced labor, there is no unpaid overtime, minimum wages are being paid, all my facilities are safe, etc. These kinds of promises tend to be unrealistic because we all know that there is no such thing as a perfectly pristine supply chain. We know that there are issues, human rights and environmental, across global supply chains. That's why human rights and environmental due diligence is the more pragmatic frame for dealing with these issues. So we know that these promises are actually unrealistic, but they are also dangerous because they often come, as Martijn said, with an immediate termination provision. It says any kind of default, any deviation from our code of conduct will give us the right to terminate the contract. And that's dangerous because if a supplier realizes that something, an adverse impact has happened or is happening, and they know that the consequences of revealing that could be that the contract will be terminated, they may well be incentivized to hide the problem and not disclose it and not remediate it. So actually, these one-sided promises tend to be quite dangerous for human rights. The other defect of contracting as usual is that they tend to ignore the buyer side of the responsibility to avoid contributing to adverse human rights and environmental impacts via, for example, their purchasing practices. As Martijn said, there is an endemic problem of buyers imposing excessively low prices, short turnaround times, making last-minute changes to their orders, shifting not just the responsibility, but also the costs associated with carrying out due diligence or managing human rights and environmental risks, providing little to no assistance to their suppliers to meet their own human rights standards, human rights and environmental standards. So one of the complaints that we hear the most often from suppliers is that buyers want gold human rights standards, but they're not even willing to pay a bronze price. This is a real problem for effective due diligence. If you have purchasing practices that are actually aggravating human rights risks, that is an issue for due diligence. The last defect is that traditional contracts tend to prioritize traditional contract remedies in the event of a breach. So remedies that would flow from the breaching party, the supplier, to the non-breaching party, the buyer, and which do not actually address the grievances of the victims of the social breach of contract. The people actually harmed by the breach are not considered under traditional contracts in the remedies provisions of traditional contracts. So all of these deficits make traditional contracting actually ineffective for purposes of managing human rights and environmental risk. And now that we know the CS3D is coming, now that we know we already have the German due diligence law in place, but also in the US we have an increasing array of trade sanction laws, effectiveness is actually becoming a requirement. It's actually becoming a legal requirement. And so we need to upgrade our approach to contracts to root it rather than in risk shifting in shared responsibility as indicated in the UNGPs and the OECD guidelines and OECD guidance. So the three core principles of responsible contracting that are enshrined in the EMCs and that serve to counter the defects of traditional contracting are to have, first, a shared commitment to cooperate between both parties in carrying out human rights and environmental due diligence throughout the life of the agreement. Second, a buyer commitment to engage in responsible purchasing practices that can actually support effective HREDD, support the supplier's own human rights and environmental performance. And third, and critically important, to prioritize human rights remediation over traditional remedies to avoid cutting and running or suspending payments or terminating the contract, and instead, before you get to that place where you need to disengage, to prioritize remediation. This would bring us in line with the UNGPs, the OECD guidance, and now the new legislation. Here we have a side-by-side comparison of traditional contracts and HRDD aligned contracts, and these slides are available for us, for you to check out in your own time. I will stop there and pass it on to Beata.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much, Martin. And let me just add that it's a pleasure and really also an intellectual feast to be part of this project. So just to add from the civil society perspective, perhaps it's to add that for us, one of the key elements in the process is that, as was already stressed, the European model contract clauses are intended to serve really as a template for effective and appropriate due diligence-aligned contracting. So thus, in the process of drafting of the European model clauses, the attention was really given to ensuring this alignment that Sarah already has mentioned, the alignment with the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, the 2023 OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct, the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, as well as German law on due diligence in the supply chains, as well as, to the extent possible, because obviously we are still in the process, we still don't have the final version of the CSDDD, but also the alignment with this proposal that we have seen from the European Commission. As you know, in 2022, the European Commission has published proposal for the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which aims to create this very strong legally binding obligation for companies to carry out human rights and environmental due diligence throughout their own operations, but also those of their business partners across, well, we'll see whether it's a full value chain or just some parts of it. But what needs to be stressed is that contractual provisions really play a role throughout the proposal, as the Commission really recognizes the fact that contracts have an important role to play as a key component of the due diligence exercise. And even under Article 12, it commits to adopting relevant guidance about voluntary model contract clauses to assist companies in meeting the requirements of the directive. But although CSDDD really mentions the need for contract clauses to be developed and available, I think one cannot forget that contracts will be equally crucial to meet conditions listed also in the minimum safeguards under taxonomy regulation or under sustainability finance disclosure regulation, both of which refer to obviously OECD guidelines. Taxonomy also clearly mentions UN guiding principles and ILO fundamental conventions. Hence why we really tried in this project to ensure that European model clauses are universal and not solely aligned with a future CSDDD, simply because we won't even know at this stage what CSDDD will really cover. So what we do know at the moment, after the political compromise reached last week, is that it seems that CSDDD will not be fully aligned with UNGPs and OECD guidelines. Hence why we think that actually the approach we have taken is better for companies, because it will provide some safety of having contractual clauses that they can apply also in the context of taxonomy and the other EU legislations that I've mentioned before. And we think it's really important because this is what is really necessary to ensure that responsible purchasing practices are really no longer an exception, but a norm. So just finishing, let me perhaps just say a few words how we want to get to this point. The current consultation carried online will last until January 15th. And after that, working group under the Professor Scheltema leadership will integrate the feedback into a zero draft, which hopefully will be ready and published by early March 2024. After that, we'll hold much bigger consultation, which will last probably between March and July 2024. And this will cover also a mix of webinars and in-person and virtual meetings with stakeholders, both from Global North, but also Global South. After that, throughout the summer, we plan to integrate the feedback into the final version of the European model clauses, and we hope to finalize the process by early autumn 2024. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. And I think, well, this was very helpful in the explanation of what we are trying to achieve and also what the European model clauses are about. So I think we'll conclude our session with that. And we hope many of you will at least read the model clauses, but hopefully also will kind of engage in our consultations, because I think it's very important to also hear your perspectives on our model clauses. And well, that will definitely help us to improve the clauses and to further develop them. Thank you very much for your attention.